I remember the sound before I felt the pain. It was sharp and clean like a slap against metal. 1 second, I was standing at attention in my dress whites with the California sun hitting the parade ground at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, and the next, the air itself seemed to fracture. The insignia was still warm in my hand. My name had just been called Chief Petty Officer Sloan Maddox, and the men and women I had trained with stood in 2 precise lines on either side of me. My heart was steady. My mind was calm. Then Douglas stepped forward. I saw the look on his face even before anyone else moved. The lines around his mouth were hard and twisted the way they used to look when I was 15, and he thought I should be afraid of him. He pushed past a row of chairs like the ceremony was his to interrupt. The captain raised a hand, security shifted, but no one expected what happened next. He came right up to me and hissed something only I could hear. His breath smelled like bitterness and cheap coffee. Then his hand swung up and connected with my jaw. The sound cracked across the silent parade ground. Every breath in the crowd froze. I did not fall. I did not even step back. His hand hung there like he could not believe what he had done. My jaw throbbed a dull bloom spreading down my neck, but my spine locked straight like a steel rod. The captain stood up from his chair so fast it scraped against the concrete. Chief Logan Ward moved before the MPs could and grabbed Douglas by the arm. People were shouting now, but it was all far away. The only thing I felt was the cold air sliding down the back of my collar and the weight of every single pair of eyes on me. My mother's face was pale in the first row hands pressed to her mouth, frozen like the rest of them. I looked at Douglas and saw exactly what he expected to see. The same fear he had carved into me as a girl. The humiliation he wanted to stitch into the best day of my career. But I had trained to breathe through the storm. My jaw burned. My fingers curled behind my back. My boots stayed locked to the ground. The MPs swarmed in and pulled him away as his voice turned loud and ugly, the kind of sound that once ruled my childhood. They dragged him toward the gate, but I never moved. I stood at the center of the formation with my head high and my eyes locked straight ahead. It felt like the world had narrowed to a single point of stillness, and that point was me. I could hear the flags snapping in the wind. I could hear the uneven rhythm of Douglas's boots scraping the pavement as they hauled him away. Someone whispered behind me. Someone else cursed softly. None of it mattered. This was the day he had tried to own. This was the day he had chosen to show the world what he really was. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to hit him back. I only needed to stand there and let every single person present see what he had done to me. The captain approached slowly, his face carved into something colder than command. "Chief Maddox," he said low and steady. I nodded once crisp. My jaw ached, but I kept my teeth together. He turned toward the formation and spoke loud enough for the wind to carry his words. "The ceremony is paused. Military police secure the area." His voice was a hammer on stone. I saw the faces of my teammates. Fury, shock, something else that burned behind their eyes. They had seen training accidents and deployment chaos. They had not seen this. A man hitting a Navy SEAL in uniform on her promotion day. I breathed once, twice, slow and deep the way they teach you to breathe underwater. Then I lifted my chin, just a fraction higher. I could feel the weight of history pressing in. This moment would not vanish when the ceremony resumed. This moment would be remembered. If you have ever seen someone cross a line they can never return from, you know the silence that follows. It is not calm. It is sharp and heavy. And in that silence, I made a decision. I was done letting Douglas Maddox control any part of my story. This was the day he thought he could break me. This was the day the world would learn how wrong he was. If you have ever witnessed someone finally cross the line, stay with me. I was 10 years old when Douglas Maddox moved into our small house in San Diego. He came with the smell of old cigarettes and aftershave, a heavy voice, and a way of filling every room that left no air for anyone else. My mother smiled a lot in those early months, like she was trying to convince herself that we were a family. He never yelled at first. He simply watched. He watched how I walked, how I played, how I spoke. I learned quickly that with Douglas, silence was safer than talking. When I turned 12, my middle school coach pulled my mother aside and told her I had a natural talent for running. There was a team tryout that weekend. I was excited. I came home with the flyer folded carefully in my backpack. Douglas took one look at it, laughed without humor, and said girls were too fragile for serious sports. He ripped the paper in half like it was a joke. I stood in the kitchen and said nothing while my mother turned her back to wash dishes. That was the first time I felt a door close inside me. By the time I was 15, Douglas had a way of controlling everything that touched my life. My allowance was his decision. What I wore was his decision. What I read, who I saw when I spoke. He said it was about keeping me safe. What he meant was that control made him feel strong. When I mentioned once that I wanted to join the Navy after high school, his mouth curled into that sharp, familiar line. He told me no real man would ever respect a woman in uniform. He said I should focus on something sensible. I remember the way his words stuck to the walls of that narrow kitchen, the way my mother didn't look up. Every insult he threw was wrapped in certainty. When I was 16, he started keeping the checkbook in a locked drawer. My mother earned money, but he decided how to spend it. It was a rule in the house that he did not have to explain. It was also the year I started running in the dark before school barefoot on the quiet neighborhood streets, trying to feel something that belonged only to me. I counted the days to graduation. At 17, I met a Navy recruiter at a career fair. He was a quiet man with a calm presence. He handed me a brochure about opportunities for women in the military. I kept it hidden between the pages of my biology textbook. That summer, Douglas lectured me about loyalty, about how I owed him obedience for raising me. I listened and stared at the wall behind him, memorizing the peeling paint instead of his face. The day I turned 18, I signed the enlistment papers. He found out the night before I shipped out. He pounded on my bedroom door, shouting that I was making the worst mistake of my life. He told me I would crawl back. I sat on my bed with my packed duffel at my feet and felt something I had never felt before. It wasn't fear. It was the quiet certainty that once I left, he would never control me again. The Navy was not easy. Boot camp stripped me down and built me into someone else. I carried the weight of every word he had ever thrown at me and used it as fuel. I ran farther. I trained harder. Every mile I completed was one more mile between me and the house in San Diego. By the time I was selected for specialized training, Douglas had stopped calling. My mother sent letters careful and short. When I completed my first deployment, she came to visit alone. Douglas's absence felt like sunlight on skin that had been too long in the shade. I rose through the ranks slowly but surely. Petty officer, third class, then second, then first. When I entered the pipeline that would lead to SEAL assignments, I heard his voice again in my head. He said I was weak, that no one would respect me. Those words used to feel like shackles. In the training field, they turned into something else. They became a fire in my lungs. The first time I made it through a 20-mile conditioning run, soaked in sweat, every muscle burning, I whispered under my breath, not for anyone else but me, that he had been wrong. For years, Douglas had lived like his authority was a crown, and I was part of his territory. When I wore that Navy uniform for the first time, I stopped belonging to him. The letters from home grew stranger over the years. He started writing again short notes hidden inside my mother's envelopes. He called my career a phase. He mocked the idea of me becoming anything more than a dependent child. Each word reminded me why I had joined in the first place. He saw my success not as mine, but as something stolen from his control. Every time I advanced, he called it betrayal. By the time I reached 30, I had spent 12 years proving him wrong without ever saying a word to him. The day of the promotion ceremony, he walked onto the base like he still had that crown. What he never understood was that I had burned it a long time ago. 3 weeks before the promotion ceremony, the calls started coming almost every evening. The first time I saw his name flash across my phone, I felt the air in my apartment tighten. Douglas Maddox was not a man who called to talk. He called to press buttons to remind me of the weight he thought he still had over me. I sat on the small couch in my living room, still wearing my training sweats, and stared at the screen. I could have ignored him. I almost did. but a part of me, the part that grew up listening for the sound of his footsteps, still answered. His voice came through the speaker with that same heavy certainty I remembered. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't congratulate me. He started talking about the ceremony. He said he'd already told my mother he was coming. He said it like it was his right. I let him speak and counted my breaths. When he said I didn't deserve to wear that uniform, something inside me went very still. I asked him to repeat it, and he did slower this time, like he wanted each word to land. You don't deserve to wear that uniform. It wasn't a new sentence. I'd heard versions of it since I was a teenager, but hearing it now after everything I had bled and sweated through made the room around me seem smaller. I ended the call before he could keep going. I stared at the phone for a long time after that. The second call came 2 days later, then the third. Each time he repeated the same line in a slightly different way. He talked about how the military was not a place for someone like me. He laughed when he said it. It wasn't loud. It was that soft, knowing laugh he used when he thought he had already won. I stopped answering on the third call. On the fourth, I recorded it. My phone sat face down on the table while his voice spilled into the quiet of my living room. He talked about how he would stand in the front row, how he would make sure everyone understood the truth about me. The way he said it was careful, controlled. It wasn't the rant of someone out of control. It was the promise of someone who thought he still owned a piece of me. When I told my mother about the calls, she didn't say much. I could hear the tension in her silence. She said he was just upset that he didn't mean half the things he said. I remembered that exact sentence from when I was 15. She had used it after every slammed door, after every sharp word that carved its way through the house. Her loyalty to keeping the peace had always been stronger than her loyalty to the truth. I realized then that she wouldn't stop him from coming. She would stand beside him, quiet as always, watching the damage and calling it unfortunate. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my phone and pressed play. His voice filled the room again. I closed my eyes and forced myself to listen to every word, not because I needed to hear them, but because I needed to strip them of their power. Every insult sounded smaller on tape than it had in real time. It reminded me that he was just a man who thrived on being believed. This time, I didn't believe him. I brought the recording to Chief Logan Ward the next day. Logan was the kind of man who didn't waste words. He listened without interrupting. He had served long enough to understand that danger doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it wears the face of family. When the recording ended, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "You should let base security know," he said. I shook my head. It felt too personal, too raw. He didn't argue. He just said, "Then at least keep the phone ready." His calm steadiness had always been a quiet anchor. In the following days, Douglas kept calling. He left voicemails that shifted between fake apologies and thinly veiled threats. One night, he said he would stand at the ceremony and make sure the truth came out. I didn't need to ask what truth he meant. It was the same lie he had told himself for years, that I was weak, that I didn't belong, that no matter how far I ran, he would always have the power to drag me down. I started sleeping less. It wasn't fear that kept me awake. It was the familiar feeling of waiting for something I couldn't control. I lay in bed listening to the hum of the bass outside my window, the distant sound of waves rolling against the shore. I had survived worse than his words, but the thought of him standing at my ceremony, surrounded by people who had fought and trained beside me, lit a slow fuse under my ribs. Logan checked on me every few days without making a big deal of it. He would stop by the training field, toss me a bottle of water, and ask casually if the calls had stopped. I always said no. He didn't tell me to be strong. He knew I already was. What he did was remind me that I wasn't alone. He said if Douglas showed up, security would handle it. He said no one disrespects a SEAL on this base. Not in front of him. A week before the ceremony, Douglas left a message that made the hair on my neck stand up. He said, "You'll see. Everyone will see." He didn't shout. He whispered it like a promise. I saved the message and sent a copy to Logan. He called me 5 minutes later and said, "That's enough. I'm telling security." I didn't stop him this time. For the first time in years, I found myself walking the perimeter of the base after lights out, the cool air brushing against my face, my boots quiet on the concrete. I thought about every mile I had run to get away from him. I thought about how far I had come. It wasn't fear that burned in my chest now. It was something cleaner and sharper. I wasn't the girl who used to flinch at his footsteps anymore. 3 weeks before my promotion, Douglas thought he still had power over me. He thought the past was still the present. What he didn't understand was that the uniform he despised was more than fabric and rank. It was proof that I had built a life beyond his reach, and soon enough he would learn just how far beyond it I truly was. The morning of the promotion ceremony, the sky over Coronado was the kind of clear blue that seems almost unreal. The air was crisp but warm, and the ocean breeze carried the faint scent of salt across the base. The American flag snapped in the wind above the parade ground, its sound sharp and rhythmic like a drumbeat. Rows of sailors and operators stood at perfect attention in their dress whites boots, polished to mirrors eyes forward. Behind the assembled formation sat families in neat rows of folding chairs, their faces a mix of pride and nerves. My mother sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the stage. Next to her, Douglas sat rigid, a fixed expression on his face that looked almost like pride to anyone who did not know better. The stage itself gleamed in the sunlight, the wooden steps polished the microphone catching the light. Captain Henry Cole stood at the podium, his voice steady and ceremonial as he moved down the list of names. My pulse was steady, my uniform immaculate, my shoes biting against the pavement in the best way. I stood in the front row of the candidates, my spine-straight hands tight at my sides. Years of training had taught me how to stand still, how to breathe through anything. I could feel Logan standing 2 places behind me, a quiet, steady presence. The captain's voice rolled through the air, formal and calm. "Chief Petty Officer Sloan Maddox." My name echoed across the formation. I stepped forward, my heartbeat matching the rhythmic beat of boots on the ground. The sunlight hit my face as I climbed the 3 wooden steps up to the stage. Everything felt controlled, contained. I reached the center facing the captain. He smiled faintly as he reached for the insignia, a simple, polished emblem that represented years of blood, sweat, and silence. My hand extended to receive it. Then, in the corner of my vision, movement broke the perfect symmetry. Douglas rose from his chair. At first, it looked like a simple misstep, maybe a proud parent wanting a closer look. Then he pushed past the knees of the people beside him. A woman gasped as he nearly stumbled into the aisle. I saw my mother's hand reach for his arm and then stop. Her face was pale, her eyes locked on him. Douglas kept moving. Security hesitated because no one expected a man in the front row at a Navy promotion ceremony to storm the stage. He moved up the steps like he belonged there. Logan shifted in the formation. I saw it in the corner of my eye, but I did not move. The captain turned confusion flickering across his face. Douglas's mouth twisted into a half smile. He looked out at the crowd of sailors at the formation of SEALs who had spent years fighting and training, and then he looked at me. "This is all a lie," he said, his voice louder than I had ever heard it. It sliced through the perfect morning air. "She is weak. I know who she really is." His words landed like stones thrown into glass. A ripple went through the crowd. Someone in the second row muttered something sharp. Security started moving, but they were seconds too late. Douglas took the last step up and stood beside me. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to tilt. I smelled the salt in the air, felt the weight of the uniform on my shoulders, heard the faint rustle of flags behind me. Then his hand swung up. It happened faster than most people could register, but I saw it in perfect clarity. His hand cut through the air, caught the light, and then collided with my jaw. The sound cracked like a gunshot across the silent parade ground. My head snapped to the side. Pain bloomed down my neck in a slow, burning wave. For a second, everything else fell away. I heard the sound of someone gasping in the front row. My mother's chair scraped against the pavement. The captain's voice turned sharp, issuing orders to security. But in my world, there was only the steady thud of my heartbeat and the echo of his hand against my face. I straightened slowly, pulling my chin back in line. The formation was frozen. No one breathed. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Logan's eyes locked on mine from where he stood in formation, steady ready. Douglas's hand was still hanging there, as if even he could not believe what he had just done. The MPs moved fast then. Two uniformed men bounded up the stairs, hands on him before he could take another breath. He twisted, shouted something that blurred into the wind, but I did not hear the words. My boots stayed planted. My jaw ached, but my spine was steel. Captain Cole stepped between us like a wall. His face had lost the calm, ceremonial expression. It was cold, sharp, all authority. He signaled the MPs with a single clipped motion. Douglas was dragged backward down the steps, his voice trailing behind him. The flag kept snapping in the wind. The crowd was still silent, a silence that felt like the weight of a storm pressing down. My mother had her hand over her mouth. Her shoulders shook. The captain turned toward the formation and spoke in a voice that cut through everything. "This ceremony is paused. Military police secure the perimeter." His words landed like an order on the battlefield. The sailors shifted slightly, but no one broke rank. The MPs carried Douglas past the front row. His shoes scraped against the pavement. His face twisted from rage to something closer to panic. I didn't look down at him. I kept my eyes forward, my body locked into the same position I had stood in during deployments, during storms, during moments when the world tilted and demanded I stand unbroken. In the silence that followed, I could hear someone breathing too fast in the crowd. I could hear the distant rush of the ocean. I could feel the bruise forming along my jaw. But above all, I felt the stillness inside me calm and sharp. He had chosen this moment to make his statement. He thought he could humiliate me in front of everyone who mattered. Instead, he showed them exactly who he was. It would not be the end of the story. It was the beginning, and as the MPs led him away, I raised my chin a fraction higher. This was my ceremony. My name had already been called. The rank was already mine. No one could take that from me, not even him. The MPs dragged Douglas off the stage and down the main aisle, his shoes scraping against the concrete as his voice cracked into something between rage and disbelief. He twisted against their grip, but it was useless. These weren't the kind of men who gave ground. The ceremony space just moments ago, filled with ceremony and precision, now felt like a live wire had been dropped into it. My mother stood from her chair but didn't move toward him. Her hands were clenched together so tightly that the knuckles showed white tears streaking down her face. She wasn't crying for me. She was crying for the wreckage. She had always been afraid of choosing sides, and in that moment, she chose silence. Captain Cole's voice came hard and clear through the loudspeaker. "The ceremony is suspended. All personnel hold your positions." The words rolled like a command on deployment. The formation did not break, but the silence had changed. It wasn't ceremonial anymore. It was heavy-charged, holding its breath around the bruise forming on my jaw. I kept my head straight until the last trace of Douglas's voice was gone. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding. Captain Cole turned toward me. His eyes weren't full of pity. They were sharp, steady, professional. "Chief Maddox, follow me," he said quietly. Not into the mic, just for me. I nodded once, crisp and controlled, and stepped down from the stage with the same deliberate steps I had climbed it with. We moved through the corridor behind the parade ground, the echo of our footsteps bouncing off the walls. It smelled like floor wax and polished wood. The sunlit air outside was replaced by the dim, cool quiet of the admin wing. He opened the door to a small room just off the hallway, a simple office with 2 chairs and a long table. I stepped inside. He didn't offer me sympathy. He didn't ask me if I was all right. Instead, he said, "Take a moment. I'll handle the rest." Then he closed the door behind him and left me alone with the hum of the air conditioner. For a while, I didn't move. I stood with my hands resting on the table and my jaw throbbing in a steady rhythm that matched the beat of my pulse. The fluorescent light overhead flickered softly. I'd been through combat training through deployments where seconds meant the difference between walking away or not, but this silence felt different. This was the sound of every eye in that ceremony freezing the moment in their memory. Douglas had made sure of that. I touched my jaw lightly. The skin was hot, but my hands were steady. That mattered more than anything. A soft knock came on the door, and before I could answer it, Logan stepped in. He closed the door behind him, his face hard but calm. He didn't waste time on hollow comfort. He just said I got everything. I didn't have to ask what he meant. The base cameras, the witnesses, his own eyes. He'd been close enough to see every detail. MPs are taking him to processing. They're not playing around, he added. His voice carried that low certainty that came from too many deployments. And you don't need to say a word right now. We've got your back. I nodded once. Behind him came two more of my teammates. They didn't speak at first. They just stood in that small room with the kind of quiet solidarity only people who've bled through the same training can offer. One of them slid a cold bottle of water across the table. I unscrewed the cap and drank half of it in one pull. The cold shock in my throat brought everything into sharp focus. My heart wasn't racing. My breathing was steady. My hands didn't shake. And somewhere inside, below the sting of the bruise, there was a clean edge of anger. Not the kind that burned out of control, but the kind that was patient. Logan leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He's not walking away from this Sloan. This isn't some family spat. I let out a breath through my nose. I know, I said quietly. I'm not going to give him what he wants. What he wants, Logan said, is for you to react, to lose your center. I looked at him, the steel in my spine settling even deeper. Then I won't. The door opened again and Captain Cole stepped back inside. His posture was as controlled as ever, but his voice had a harder edge now. Douglas Maddox has been detained. He's off the base. MPs have the footage and so do we. A report's being filed immediately. JAG will be looped in within the hour. He looked at me not as a victim, but as a chief. You did the right thing by not escalating. That matters. I nodded. My voice was steady when I finally said, he wanted to humiliate me in front of my people. He's not getting anything more than that one moment. Cole's eyes narrowed with quiet approval. Good, he said. You focus on your duty. We'll handle the rest. Then he stepped back out, giving me the space he knew I needed. When the room was silent again, I let my fingers rest on the table and traced the grain in the wood like an anchor. There had been a time when Douglas's voice was enough to make me doubt everything. That time was long gone. I wasn't the girl in the kitchen listening to him tear down my dreams anymore. I was a chief petty officer, and this wasn't his house. It was my base. Logan walked over and rested a hand briefly on my shoulder, the kind of gesture that said more than any words. You're not alone in this, he said quietly. He'll answer for it. Every inch of it. I know, I replied. Outside the door, I could hear the distant sound of the ceremony being broken down. No more speeches. No music. Just the quiet discipline of a military machine adjusting to the shock of what had happened. The world didn't stop spinning, but it shifted. As the minutes stretched, I sat down at the table and let the anger settle into something colder. Douglas had thrown his blow in public. That was his first mistake. His second was believing that the girl he once controlled still existed. She didn't. What stood on that stage wasn't someone who crumbled. It was someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to turn humiliation into strategy. I didn't need revenge that came from rage. I needed precision. When Logan left the room, I stayed behind for a few minutes longer, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the fading sound of boots moving outside. Then I stood, adjusted my collar, and walked out into the hallway with my jaw still aching but my stride steady. This wasn't over, but from here on out I would decide exactly how the rest of the story would be written. The next morning, the air on base was different. It had the quiet heaviness of something that everyone knew had happened, but no one spoke about openly. People nodded at me as I walked past their eyes, saying what their mouths wouldn't. It wasn't pity. It was respect wrapped in something sharper. Douglas had made sure the entire ceremony would be remembered. What he didn't know was that so would I. I walked into the legal office like I'd walked into 100 other rooms before. Calm, measured, ready. The sign outside the door read, Judge Advocate General. Inside, the air smelled like paper and coffee. The legal officer, Lieutenant Commander Harris, sat behind his desk with a stack of folders in front of him. He'd already heard. Everyone had. He didn't bother with small talk. Chief Maddox, he said evenly. I understand there was an incident yesterday. I placed my phone on the desk screen, unlocked audio files ready. Then I handed him a small USB stick with the base security footage that Logan had secured within an hour after the ceremony. Finally, I slid a short list across the table names of witnesses who'd seen everything from less than 20 feet away. Logan was at the top of that list. Harris leaned back, studying each piece of information like a man assembling the edges of a puzzle. "This is clear assault," he said after a long moment. His voice carried no uncertainty. "And it happened on federal property. This isn't just base discipline. This is federal." I nodded but said nothing. Silence wasn't a shield anymore. It was a blade. He asked a few procedural questions. Dates, times, whether Douglas had contacted me after the incident. I gave him the facts clean and without emotion. I didn't need to make it sound worse than it was. The truth was enough. When he finished taking notes, Harris met my eyes with the look of someone who had done this many times before, but rarely against someone's own family. "You understand this won't stay quiet," he said. "It will become a formal case. Local law enforcement may be looped in because of California's assault statutes, but it starts with us." He hit a uniformed service member during an official ceremony on a federal base. "That's not something that goes away." "I understand," I said. My voice didn't waver. I'd had years to build it. Later that afternoon, I sat in a small room with a recorder on the table, giving my official statement to the JAG investigator. I described the calls leading up to the ceremony word for word, how he told me I didn't deserve to wear the uniform. I described how he pushed past the crowd, how his hand cut through the air, the sound it made when it struck. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't add anything unnecessary. They had the footage. They had the audio. They had Logan. The record would speak for itself. The MPs confirmed they had processed Douglas the night before. He had been released to civilian authorities pending charges. A restraining order was already in motion. Base command didn't need to hold meetings to decide whether what happened was acceptable. It wasn't. Harris told me the words that burned cold in the air. He will be charged. Federal assault. California assault. This won't be buried under family matter. That night, I walked along the edge of the base near the water. The Pacific stretched out black and endless under the faint orange of the streetlights. My jaw still ached, but beneath it was a new kind of quiet. Not the kind Douglas used to trap me in as a kid. This was my quiet. Strategic. Controlled. I'd learned to wait. I'd learned to build plans from silence. Publicly, I said nothing. No interviews, no statements. Not even to the sailors who looked at me like I'd detonated a grenade in the middle of tradition. But privately, I moved every piece into place. I called Logan into my office the next day. He shut the door behind him without needing to be told. I slid the printout of the JAG timeline across the desk. It was a simple flowchart. Statement. Witness confirmation. Evidence submission. Federal coordination. Trial. Every line was clean and deliberate. "You're going through with it," he said, not really asking. I nodded. "He chose the ground," I said. "But I'll choose the outcome." Logan exhaled through his nose, a small flicker of a grin pulling at the corner of his mouth. Good. He has no idea what he's up against. Within a week, Harris had coordinated with the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Diego. Assaulting a service member in uniform on federal property was more than just a slap. It was a legal line you didn't cross without consequences. Douglas was served formal charges. It was no longer a family problem. It was United States versus Douglas Maddox, and that made all the difference. I didn't attend the hearings in person, not the first ones. My lawyers didn't need me there for that. But I read every word of every motion filed. Each one was another weight on the scale. For years, Douglas had thrived in places without accountability, behind closed doors, at kitchen tables, in conversations my mother refused to challenge, but the courtroom was not his kitchen. The JAG office was not his living room, and the base cameras didn't care about his excuses. When I saw him on the base CCTV footage for the last time, the moment they escorted him out of the ceremony, his face wasn't the face of a man in control. It was the face of someone who'd finally stepped into a world where his voice meant nothing. I kept my life on base as normal as possible. Training, early mornings, PT, briefings. But every step was deliberate. Every conversation with JAG, Every document I signed, every audio file I handed over was part of the quiet architecture of the trap I was building around him. I didn't need to raise my voice. The law was loud enough. My mother tried to call me twice. I didn't answer. I knew what she would say. She would tell me he was sorry, that he didn't mean it, that he'd lost control. But that wasn't true. Douglas had been in control his whole life, until now. Harris kept me updated. His tone never changed, steady and practical. "This is moving fast," he said after the third meeting. "The evidence is clean. His defense has nowhere to go." I walked out of his office that day and paused at the end of the hallway. The base outside was alive with its usual rhythm. Sailors moving in formation, vehicles passing, flags snapping in the wind. For the first time, the memory of Douglas's voice didn't settle in my chest like a weight. It floated there powerless. I chose silence as my strategy because silence was something I had learned to own. While Douglas was out there scrambling for excuses, I was laying bricks in the foundation of the case that would bury his illusion of power. And he didn't even know it yet. 2 weeks after the incident, I sat at a long, polished table in one of the legal conference rooms on base. The windows were covered, the air cool, the overhead lights humming softly. On one side of the table sat Lieutenant Commander Harris and 2 representatives from Base Command. On the other side sat Douglas Maddox and his attorney, a man in a Navy suit who looked like he had spent more time in air conditioning than under real sunlight. Between us sat a recorder, red light blinking steadily. This wasn't a living room argument. This was official. Douglas looked smaller than he had the day he hit me. He wore a pressed shirt and a cheap tie. His hair was slicked back as if he thought a neat appearance could erase what he'd done. His jaw was tight, but his eyes still carried that familiar flicker of arrogance. He glanced at me once, expecting me to flinch the way I used to when I was younger. I didn't. I sat perfectly still in my service khakis, hands folded loosely on the table, jaw still carrying a faint shadow of the bruise that hadn't fully faded. Harris opened the meeting with the steady formality of someone who'd done this 100 times before. "This is an official pre-trial conference regarding the federal assault charges against Mr. Douglas Maddox," he said. "All statements are recorded." The attorney cleared his throat like he was about to give a performance. "My client," he began, "maintains that this incident has been misunderstood. There was a history between the 2 parties. Emotions were high. She, meaning Chief Maddox, provoked him. She intentionally embarrassed him in front of others, leading to a momentary lapse of control. The words landed exactly how they were meant to, a rehearsed inversion of guilt." Douglas leaned back in his chair, watching me. For years, he'd counted on my silence. He thought this would be no different. I said nothing. Harris's expression didn't change. "We'll let the evidence speak," he said. "Chief Maddox." I nodded once and tapped the folder in front of me. Logan stood quietly near the back of the room, not as a lawyer but as a witness. Behind him, 2 more sailors who had been in the front row that day stood at parade rest, their faces neutral but their presence loud. This wasn't just me and him. This was a room full of people who had seen what happened. I placed the audio recorder on the table and pressed play. The attorney started to object, but Harris raised a hand. The recording filled the room. Douglas's voice poured through the speakers, clear and cold. "You don't deserve to wear that uniform." His words hung in the sterile air like oil on water. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. I let the recording play to the end, where he promised everyone would see the truth at the ceremony. Then I slid the USB across the table. Harris plugged it into the monitor on the wall. The footage from the ceremony flickered to life. Rows of sailors standing at attention. The captain calling my name. Douglas rising from the front row. My mother reaching for him and then freezing. He stormed up the steps, spat his words at the crowd, and then the slap. The sound filled the room just as it had filled the parade ground. The lawyer flinched. Douglas didn't look at the screen. He stared down at the table, his face drained of color. I didn't move. I didn't gloat. I didn't speak. Silence again became a blade. Harris let the footage finish and paused it on the frame where the MPs were dragging Douglas away. "The evidence is self-explanatory," Harris said. "There's no ambiguity. There's no provocation. This is a federal assault." The lawyer tried to recover. My client was under significant emotional distress. He had a complicated relationship with Chief Maddox. She has a history of being defiant. Harris leaned forward slowly. Being defiant isn't a crime, he said evenly. Hitting a uniformed service member during an official military ceremony on federal property is. The lawyer shut his mouth. Douglas finally spoke then. His voice was low and bitter. "You made me do this," he said. His eyes locked on mine, the same look he'd used to control me for years. "You embarrassed me. You've always been—" I didn't let him finish. I didn't have to say a word. I just met his gaze without blinking. No fear, no apology. And in that second, something cracked behind his eyes. He realized the grip he'd had on me didn't exist anymore. Harris broke the silence. "Mr. Maddox, you can either cooperate with the process or make this worse for yourself. Blaming the victim isn't going to help you here." Douglas's attorney put a hand on his arm, whispering something sharp, but Douglas pulled away. His breathing grew faster, the mask slipping. For years, he'd been the loudest voice in every room that mattered to him. Now his words didn't matter. Only the evidence did. Logan stepped forward when Harris called him. He gave his statement with the steady voice of someone who had seen more than enough in his career. He described Douglas's actions in precise detail. Then two more sailors gave their statements clean and concise. They didn't embellish. They didn't need to. The truth was loud enough. By the time they finished, Douglas sat slumped slightly in his chair. His lawyer looked tired. Harris clicked the recorder off. "We'll proceed to formal charges," he said. "This isn't a negotiation. This is a prosecution." I rose from my chair. The sound of it scraping the floor seemed louder than anything else in the room. I gathered my folder, nodded once to Harris, and walked out without looking back at Douglas. Outside the conference room, the hallway was bright and warm sunlight spilling in from the long windows. Logan caught up to me a few steps later. He looked like someone pulled the ground out from under him, he said quietly. I exhaled slowly. "He always thought the ground was his," I replied. We walked in silence for a moment. I could feel the weight of what had just happened settling into place. This was no longer something tangled up in the complicated invisible web of family history. This was no longer a story that could be softened or rewritten by anyone's excuses. This was a legal case backed by evidence witnesses and a military system that didn't care about his pride. For years, Douglas had counted on the silence of others to protect him. My mother's silence. My silence. The quiet that kept everything hidden behind closed doors. Now that silence was turned against him, it didn't protect him anymore. It exposed him. I looked down the corridor, watching sunlight stretch across the floor. Logan walked beside me without speaking. We both knew what came next. There would be hearings, depositions, a trial. He would try to twist and bend reality as he always had. But for the first time, he was facing a wall he couldn't talk his way through. He had tried to humiliate me in front of everyone I served with, but he didn't understand what it meant to stand across from a SEAL who no longer feared him. The story was no longer his to tell. It was mine. And this was only the beginning of his reckoning. The day of the public hearing was different from any formation I had ever stood in. It wasn't a deployment briefing or a training update. It was a statement. The command had made it clear this was not optional. The entire unit was required to attend, from the newest sailors to the most seasoned chiefs. Rows of chairs filled the main auditorium on base, the kind normally used for change of command ceremonies or official addresses. The flag stood on the stage, the same kind that had snapped in the wind the day Douglas struck me. But this time, there would be no speeches about rank or service. This time, there would be accountability. JAG and Base Command were lined up on the stage behind a long table. Lieutenant Commander Harris sat at the center, flanked by Captain Cole and two other officers. Their posture was formal, but their eyes said everything. They weren't just there to enforce protocol. They were there to set a standard. I sat in the front row, not hidden away, not shielded. Logan stood 2 seats down, arms folded, his face unreadable, but solid as bedrock. A low murmur ran through the crowd as sailors filled every seat. They all knew why they were here. The video had already circulated in whispers and secondhand stories, but this was different. This was official. When Captain Cole stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He didn't need to raise his voice. This hearing is being held in accordance with base protocol to address an act of violence committed on federal property during an official military ceremony, he said. His words were steady, deliberate. No theatrics, just facts. He stepped aside and Harris stood. He gestured to the large screen behind him. The evidence will be presented in full to ensure transparency to this command, Harris said. This is not rumor. This is not hearsay. This is what happened. He nodded to the technician at the back of the room. The lights dimmed slightly as the footage began to play. There was no music, no narration, just the raw video. I saw myself standing on that stage again, back straight, hands at my sides. I heard the captain call my name. I saw Douglas rise from the front row, push past the others, his face twisted with that old familiar mix of entitlement and resentment. The room held its breath. Even those who had already heard the story sat frozen. Then the moment came. His hand swung up, caught the light, and hit. The sound cracked through the room again as if it had just happened. For a second, it was so quiet I could hear someone in the third row breathing too fast. The video didn't end there. It showed the MPs moving in, dragging him down the aisle, his face shifting from fury to panic. It showed me standing on the stage, straight and unmoving, jaw burning but back unbroken. When the video ended, Harris didn't need to explain anything. The image of Douglas's hand colliding with my jaw in full view of the flag and the formation was enough. Captain Cole stepped forward. His voice was cold steel. "Kay now, sinyuk mut kunyan ngay chen ledai," he said slowly, "Sedoy mat veho kwa." He let the silence hang after that, every syllable slicing through the room. This base, this command, does not and will not tolerate violence against its own. Not from enemies, not from family, not from anyone. The entire room remained silent. Some of the younger sailors shifted slightly in their seats, their eyes wide. The senior enlisted didn't move at all. They understood the weight of what had just been said. Then, the MPs brought Douglas in. He was in handcuffs now, wearing a plain shirt and looking nothing like the man who had swaggered up those steps 3 weeks earlier. His lawyer followed, but the lawyer's face already had the dull look of someone trying to minimize the damage of something too big to control. They seated Douglas in front of the room, facing the people he had once tried to humiliate me in front of. He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Harris read the charges in a calm voice. Douglas Maddox is hereby formally charged with federal assault on a uniformed service member on federal property. He is also facing state-level charges under California assault statutes. This is a matter of record. This is not a personal dispute. This is a criminal act. The sound of the words filled the space with an unshakable finality. Douglas shifted in his seat, but no one cared. No one interrupted. The courtroom wasn't a courtroom, but it might as well have been. Outside the base, the story had already reached the local press. By the time Harris finished reading the charges, a headline had been published by the local paper, "Stepfather Assaults Female Navy SEAL at Promotion Ceremony." The reporter hadn't even needed to exaggerate. The facts were explosive enough. Inside the base, people were watching live through internal feed. It wasn't gossip anymore. It was history written in real time. When Harris finished, Captain Cole returned to the podium. He didn't look at Douglas. He looked at the formation. "You have all seen what happened," he said. "This is why we do not turn our backs on each other. This is why respect matters. This is why rank is not armor for cruelty. This is why every one of you, regardless of where you stand in this chain of command, will remember today. Because this is what happens when someone crosses the line." The MPs moved forward, cuffed Douglas again, and escorted him out of the auditorium. His head was down. There was no shouting this time, no attempt to twist the moment. His voice didn't matter anymore. When the door shut behind him, the room remained silent for a few long seconds. Then slowly Captain Cole turned to face me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. One by one, sailors rose from their seats, row after row. It wasn't coordinated or ordered. It was instinct. They turned toward me and raised their hands in salute. Logan was the first. Then the senior chiefs, then the new recruits who had only been on base for weeks. It was a wall of quiet respect, the kind that doesn't need applause or words. The sound of boots shifting in unison echoed across the room. For years, Douglas had been the loudest voice in every room we shared. But here in front of the people who knew what honor really meant, he had no voice at all. I sat there, jaw still aching, faintly hands resting on my knees, and let the salute wash over me like a tide. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. It was about the weight of a uniform and the power of standing still when someone tries to break you. When the salute ended, the sailors filed out in silence, their faces carrying something different than curiosity or pity. It was recognition. It was a shift. The story of that slap was no longer about what Douglas had done. It was about what he hadn't been able to destroy. And in the military stories like that, don't fade. They spread. 3 weeks after the public hearing, the headlines had begun to fade, but the consequences had not. Douglas lost his job 2 days after the story broke. The company didn't need a long investigation. They cited conduct unbecoming the video that everyone in town had seen and the nature of the charges against him. His name was in every local paper and on every evening broadcast. Neighbors whispered. Friends he had known for years stopped answering his calls. It was the kind of quiet isolation that creeps in slowly and then swallows everything. The trial date for his civilian assault charges had been set. The federal case was moving faster than anyone expected because the evidence was clean and simple. The base had already removed him from every list, every access point, every corner where his name might have existed. He was no longer a shadow in my daily life. He was a headline and a case file. But like all men who build their lives on control, Douglas couldn't let it end with silence. I was in my small kitchen in Coronado when I heard the knock. It wasn't a gentle knock. It was the kind that carried weight, uneven and desperate. The sun was setting through the blinds, streaking the floor with lines of gold. I froze for a breath. I didn't need to check the peephole to know who it was. I felt it. I opened the door slowly, already knowing what I would see. Douglas stood there on the porch wearing the same cheap dress shirt from the hearing, but now it hung on him like a costume that didn't fit anymore. His tie was gone. His hair was a mess. His eyes were red and wild, not from drink, but from something worse, the collapse of a man who finally realized his power was gone. He reached out as if I might help him. "Sloan," he said, his voice breaking halfway through the name. "Please. Just, please. We need to talk." His voice wasn't arrogant anymore. It was fractured. But I didn't step aside. I stood in the doorway with the frame between us like a line that would never be crossed again. He took a shuddering breath, his hands twitching at his sides. I lost everything he said, my job, my reputation. People look at me like I'm a monster. You can fix this. Just one statement. If you tell them you overreacted, if you just tell them it wasn't like they think. He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a whisper, like we were still living in the house in San Diego, like we were still playing by his rules. We're family, Sloan. Family doesn't destroy each other. Family forgives. For a long time, I just looked at him. I studied the lines on his face, the cracks forming where arrogance used to live. He looked smaller than I remembered. For years, he had been a wall I had to run through just to breathe. Now he was standing on my porch begging. He didn't understand that forgiveness had nothing to do with what he had lost. This wasn't about family. This was about the fact that he had stood in front of a flag in front of the people I served beside and tried to humiliate me with the same hand he'd used to control me as a child. I spoke slowly, each word clear and even. Family, I said, doesn't hit you in the face while you're earning what you bled for. Family doesn't humiliate you in front of the people you swore to protect. Family doesn't try to own you. I stepped closer so he could see the cold in my eyes. You did that. No one else. His lips trembled. I was angry, he said. I made a mistake. You made a choice, I corrected. And now you live with it. He reached for the doorframe as if touching it would hold him up. Please, he whispered, I'm going to lose everything. If you speak up for me, the court might go easy. Just tell them we're family. The irony stung like cold air. For years, he'd used that word to cage me. Now he was using it to save himself. I let the silence stretch between us. He squirmed under it the way he used to make me squirm when I was a kid. The difference was this time, I wasn't the one cornered. I remembered the sound of that slap. I remembered the silence afterward. I remembered the faces of my unit as they stood and saluted. That moment belonged to me now, not to him. He could not rewrite it. He could not beg it away. I straightened my shoulders and stepped back just enough to make my message clear. "You taught me something a long time ago, Douglas," I said. "You taught me what power looks like when it's used to hurt someone, but you never learned what it looks like when it breaks." He stared at me like he didn't understand. Maybe he never would. I slowly closed the door between us. His hand twitched, but he didn't try to stop me. As the latch clicked, I heard him exhale sharply. For a moment, he stood there, his shadow still visible through the glass, then he turned and walked down the steps. His shoes scraped the concrete like they had when the MPs dragged him from the ceremony. I stood there for a long time, hand on the cool metal of the doorknob. The quiet of the house wrapped around me like armor. No shouting, no bargaining, no more control. The next morning, Harris called to update me. Douglas's attorney had filed for a plea deal. The state charges would likely proceed alongside the federal case. He would still face sentencing. His desperation at my doorstep hadn't been about regret. It had been about fear. I hung up the phone and stepped outside. The air over Coronado was clear and sharp, the kind of air that feels new even when it isn't. I walked down the porch steps and watched the sun rise over the base in the distance. The same place where he had tried to break me now stood as proof that he hadn't. Forgiveness wasn't on the table. It never had been. Douglas wasn't looking for redemption. He was looking for a lifeline, and I wasn't going to give him one. Some doors once closed stay closed. Forever. The courtroom was bright and cold the morning Douglas was sentenced. The air conditioning hummed softly as people filled the rows of seats, their voices low, the kind of quiet that always settles in before something final. I sat in the second row, uniform pressed, sharp collar-straight hands resting on my knees. I didn't have to be there. My lawyer had told me that clearly, but I came anyway, not because I needed to hear the words, but because I wanted to see the end of something that had lived in the corners of my life for far too long. Douglas sat at the defense table in a gray suit that didn't fit quite right. His shoulders slumped forward like he was already tired. The man who once filled every room with his noise and control now looked like a shadow of himself. His attorney whispered something to him, probably about procedure, but his eyes never left the floor. The judge entered and the courtroom rose. When we sat again, the prosecutor began reading the charges. Assault on a uniformed service member on federal property. California state assault charges. Violation of protective order. Each word landed like another weight. Douglas didn't look up. His lawyer made a short plea for leniency. He spoke about emotional strain, about a complicated family dynamic. But his words were thin, brittle things next to the clarity of the evidence. Harris had built a case with no gaps. There were recordings, video witness statements. There was no alternate story to tell. The judge listened patient and silent. When the defense finally sat down, the courtroom held its breath. The judge's voice was even and clear. "Douglas Maddox, she said you committed an unprovoked assault on a service member during an official military ceremony on federal property. This is a serious crime. It does not matter that she is your stepdaughter. It does not matter that you were angry. What matters is that you crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed." She listed the terms of the sentence one by one. Federal assault conviction. Suspended sentence probation under federal supervision. A permanent restraining order preventing him from coming within 500 feet of me or any military installation. Mandatory counseling. Loss of access to any joint financial accounts. A lien placed on his assets to cover legal costs and restitution. I didn't smile. There was nothing to celebrate in hearing a sentence passed, but there was something steady in the way the words carried finality. He wouldn't touch my life again. Not legally, not physically, not financially. The control he had once wrapped around our lives had been stripped away in a matter of weeks, undone by a single act he had thought would make me small. When the judge finished, Douglas finally looked up. His eyes found me in the second row, and for a second I saw the flicker of the man I had known my whole life, the one who believed he owned every inch of space he stood in. But that flicker went out as quickly as it came. His world was gone. The MPs led him out of the courtroom without handcuffs. He wasn't going to prison, but with the kind of watchful escort reserved for men who had burned through every ounce of authority they thought they had. My mother sat on the opposite side of the room. She hadn't looked at me when I walked in, and she didn't look at me now. When the gavel fell, she stood slowly, her shoulders rounded. The house she and Douglas had shared was already gone. The joint accounts were frozen, the mortgage unpaid. She had told me in a single quiet voicemail that she would be leaving San Diego, going back to the small town she grew up in. She hadn't asked me for anything. She hadn't apologized either. She was just leaving. In some ways, that was the most fitting ending. She had spent her whole life avoiding conflict. Now she was running from the fallout of it. Outside the courthouse, the sun was hot and unyielding. The reporters were still there, though fewer than before. The story had burned bright in the first days and then settled into something quieter but no less permanent. Stepfather assaults female Navy SEAL at promotion ceremony had already made its way into the local archives. It would follow him for the rest of his life. The company where he had worked for 20 years had let him go, citing irreparable harm to organizational integrity. They didn't need the scandal, and they didn't need him. His neighbors, the ones who used to come over for barbecues, now crossed the street when they saw him. He had been the loud, controlling presence for so long that people had learned to orbit him. But no one orbits a fallen star. They just move on. Harris found me outside the courthouse steps. He was in his uniform, crisp and composed as always. "It's done," he said simply. I nodded. There was nothing else to say. "You did everything right, Chief," he added. "You kept your bearing. That matters more than people think." I thanked him quietly. His voice wasn't full of pride or pity, just respect. Life on base moved forward. Ceremonies came and went. New recruits arrived, bringing with them the raw energy of people who had not yet seen the weight of service. My days filled again with training drills and the rhythm of military life. But something had shifted around me. People who used to pass me in the hallway with a nod now looked at me with a different kind of acknowledgement. They weren't looking at the woman who had been hit. They were looking at the chief who had stood her ground. 2 months after the sentencing, I stood in front of the same parade ground where everything had started. The flag snapped overhead, the same sound that had filled the air on the day of the ceremony. Captain Cole stood at the podium again, but this time the event was smaller. Internal. No families, no cameras. He called my name, and I stepped forward. This time, when he pinned the commendation ribbon on my uniform, there was no chaos in the background, no shadow waiting to step forward, just the steady presence of my unit standing in perfect formation. The commendation was for conduct under duress, for professionalism in the face of personal assault, for demonstrating the values the Navy claimed to uphold. But to me, it was something simpler. It was a clean ending to the noise that had followed me my entire life. After the ceremony, Logan found me near the edge of the field. "How's the jaw?" he asked with a small grin. "Stronger than ever," I said. It was true. The bone had healed weeks ago, but something deeper had hardened too. He looked at the ribbon and nodded once. "You earned it." I shrugged. "We all did," I said, and I meant it. This wasn't just about me. It was about the people who had stood behind me when the world tried to reduce me to silence. Douglas didn't disappear completely. Men like him rarely do, but he faded. The restraining order ensured he couldn't come near the base. The financial rulings stripped away the last levers he might have used to reach for control. My mother's departure took with it any lingering ties to the past. He was a man living in the aftermath of his own choices, and I was a woman finally free of them. The local paper ran one last story after the sentencing. It was shorter, quieter. "Maddox sentenced in assault case," the headline read. It wasn't explosive anymore. It was final. I didn't read the full article. I didn't need to. Months later, walking across the base in the early morning, I passed a group of recruits running drills. One of them glanced up at me as I passed, and I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. They all knew the story. They would probably keep telling it long after I left. Not because of the slap. Not because of Douglas. But because of what came after. Because I didn't let that moment define me. Because I stood still and the world saw who really fell. The bruise on my jaw was long gone. The house where the fear used to live was gone too. All that was left was the sound of boots on pavement, the snap of a flag in the wind, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that for the first time in my life, Douglas Maddox had no power over me at all. His story was a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. Mine was still being written, and it belonged entirely to me. When the noise finally settled, when the courtroom lights dimmed and the papers stopped carrying his name, my world became quiet in a way it had never been before. Not empty, not silent in a hollow way, but quiet in the way the ocean is quiet before sunrise. I moved out of the small townhouse I had been renting near the main gate and into a modest cottage 5 minutes from the shoreline. It was nothing fancy, a white front porch, blue shutters, sand collecting at the steps from the wind. But the first night I slept there, I left the windows open and let the sound of the Pacific roll into the room like a living thing. It smelled like salt and wind and the possibility of something that wasn't tied to the past. Each morning started the same way. I'd wake before dawn, pull on running shoes, and jog down the shoreline until the horizon bled orange and gold. The air on Coronado Island always tasted a little sharper at that hour, like it carried both the weight and the freedom of everything that happened here. I used to run to escape, to push away the noise in my head. Now I ran simply because I could, because I wanted to. That difference mattered. Back on base, my role shifted in a way I hadn't expected. I returned to training duty working with incoming SEAL candidates, particularly the women trying to push through the wall that still existed quiet and unspoken in certain corners of the community. They called me Chief Maddox, but there was something different in the way they said it now. It wasn't just rank, it was weight. It was what the story had become. Every command has stories that outlive the paperwork. Stories that are told in locker rooms in the quiet corners of the mess during the 10-minute breaks after brutal drills when no one's pretending to be unbreakable. Mine had become one of those stories, not because of the slap. That was just the spark. It was because I hadn't swung back. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't folded. I'd stood still. And in a world where silence is often mistaken for weakness, that silence had roared. My days were filled with the rhythm of training pre-dawn PT endurance runs along the beach pool sessions where young candidates pushed past the edge of what they thought they could endure. I walked the line between instructor and anchor. I wasn't gentle, but I was steady. And steadiness, I learned, was something they craved more than inspiration. One morning during a particularly brutal swim evolution, I noticed one of the newer female recruits lagging behind. Her name was Reyes, 19 years old. Sharp eyes, stubborn jaw. She was strong, but she doubted herself in the water. After the drill, I found her sitting on the edge of the pool, head down, hands gripping the tile like she could hold on to something solid. I sat down beside her, not saying anything at first. She kept her eyes on the water. I heard about what happened, she said finally, her voice low and careful. Yeah, I answered just as steady. They told us during orientation about the ceremony. About how you didn't back down. She swallowed hard. I almost didn't join. My dad, he's like him. Her voice cracked a little on the last word. She didn't need to explain further. I understood. That kind of control leaves fingerprints that last long after you've escaped the hand that made them. I didn't give her a speech. I didn't tell her she was strong or brave. I just said, then you know exactly why we fight to be here. She nodded slowly, wiping at her face. When I saw you walk onto the range the first day, everyone got quiet. I thought it was because you were scary. I gave a small laugh, not unkind. I am scary, I said, and she actually smiled. But it's more than that, she continued. It's because you're proof that people like him don't win forever. I let that settle between us. No one had ever said it to me quite like that before. Proof. I wasn't trying to be a symbol. But sometimes you don't get to choose what you become to others. The Navy quietly revised parts of its internal victim protection policies in the months after the incident. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It came in through training modules, through expanded reporting chains, through additional JAG oversight for family incidents tied to service events. But I saw the difference. The language was sharper. The process was cleaner. And every new recruit who came through orientation would hear the story not officially, but through the grapevine that always runs faster than paperwork. One afternoon, I was called into Captain Cole's office. The man had a way of making silence work for him. He didn't rush, didn't posture. He just handed me a small envelope and leaned back in his chair. Commendation follow-up, he said. This isn't about that day anymore. This is about everything after. Inside was a letter recognizing the training program for female SEAL candidates that had grown since I took over part of its structure. It wasn't a medal, it wasn't a headline. It was quieter than that, but it mattered more to me than any public ceremony. "I don't think you realize how many people are watching you," he said. I met his gaze evenly. "I'm not doing this to be watched." He nodded once. "That's why it works." When I left his office, the sun was setting again, and the training field was empty except for a handful of recruits doing extra laps. Reyes was among them, head high strokes, clean and strong. Months stretched into a year, and the story that had once consumed everything in my life became a part of its foundation instead of its weight. I kept training, kept teaching. Sometimes I'd see recruits hesitate before addressing me like they were standing in front of someone larger than they expected. But once they realized I was just a woman who had refused to be broken, the walls would drop. I kept my life simple. Mornings by the ocean, long runs, evening drills, the occasional beer at a quiet bar with Logan and a few other teammates who had been there since the beginning. Logan would crack jokes about the way my name had become shorthand for quiet defiance in some corners of the base. He called it the Maddox look, the way someone shuts down a bully without lifting a finger. I always rolled my eyes, but deep down I understood what he meant. What none of them saw was that peace didn't come with trumpets or applause. It came in small moments. A soft breeze over the ocean, the sound of boots hitting the deck during morning PT, the knowledge that the fear that had once lived in the corners of my house, my head, my bones, was simply gone. One evening after a long training cycle ended, I walked to the edge of the pier alone. The sun was melting into the horizon, streaking the water with gold and rust. I leaned against the rail and let the wind tangle through my hair. In the reflection of the water, I didn't see the girl who had grown up under Douglas's shadow. I didn't see the woman standing frozen on a stage with a burning jaw. I saw someone who had taken back her life inch by inch until it was hers entirely. The sound of footsteps behind me pulled me from the thought. It was Reyes. She hesitated for a second, then walked up beside me. "Chief," she said softly. "Reyes?" I nodded. "I just got word," she said, barely containing the mix of terror and pride on her face. I passed. A smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. "I'm not surprised." She shifted awkwardly. "I just wanted to say thank you, not just for the training, for everything, for being the reason people like me think they can do this." For a long moment, I didn't answer. I didn't want to ruin the simplicity of it with words. I just placed a hand on her shoulder, firm and steady, the same way Logan had done for me once when I needed it most. "Go earn it," I said finally. She nodded, her eyes shining, and walked away toward the barracks. I turned back to the ocean. The legacy of what happened wasn't written in newspapers anymore. It was written in the way new recruits stood taller, in the way whispers about silence and strength carried through the ranks, in the way people like Reyes no longer had to wonder if the system would stand behind them. Peace didn't mean nothing happened anymore. It meant when things did happen, they couldn't own me. Douglas was still somewhere out there, probably in a quiet house far from here, surrounded by his own silence. But that was his story to live with, not mine. Mine was written in the steady rhythm of boots on sand, the crisp snap of flags in the wind, the laughter of recruits breaking through their own barriers, the quiet strength that had turned into something bigger than me. Every so often, someone new would show up at the training facility with a look in their eyes that I recognized instantly. Fear disguised as determination. I'd look at them, and they'd look at me, and something unspoken would pass between us. They didn't need me to say anything. They just needed proof. And I'd been living proof every day since that ceremony. On the anniversary of the promotion day, Logan and I walked down to the beach after evening drills. The sky was the same shade of bruised pink it had been that morning a year earlier. He handed me a cold bottle of water and leaned back on the sand. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stood still that day?" he asked quietly. I thought about it. I thought about the way silence can be a blade or a cage. I thought about the girl I used to be and the woman who stood on that stage. I let the waves crash once before I answered. "No," I said finally, because I did stand still, and that's all that matters. He nodded, a small smile flickering. "That's why they salute you." I shook my head, but I didn't argue. The salutes, the looks, the whispers, they weren't really about me. They were about something bigger, something that happens when one person says enough and the world has no choice but to listen. The tide crept up over our boots, cool and clean. The night settled in around us. The fear that had once lived in every corner of my chest was nothing but memory now. I didn't need to fight it anymore. I just lived, and that more than anything else was my victory. The morning air on base was crisp, the kind that bites just enough to make every breath feel awake. The sun was still low bleeding gold across the water as I stepped onto the parade ground in my uniform. The flag snapped in the wind above me, the same sound that once filled this place with shock and silence. My boots echoed softly against the concrete. This stretch of ground had once been the place where my jaw burned, where his hand came down where the world held its breath. Now it belonged to me again. I walked slowly, not because I was hesitant, but because I wanted to feel every step. The world looked different when the past stopped holding you hostage. The ocean gleamed in the distance, the breeze carried the smell of salt and sunlight, and the parade ground no longer felt like a stage where something terrible had happened. It felt like a place where something powerful had begun. In the months since that day, the story had spread beyond Coronado. It wasn't in the papers anymore, not in the loud way it had been at first. But in the Navy, stories move like currents beneath the surface. They travel in whispers between recruits, in the quiet of the barracks, in the knowing looks exchanged during inspections. And now the story of the slap was no longer about what was taken from me. It was about what couldn't be taken. I paused at the center of the field, the same spot where I had stood frozen a lifetime ago. I could almost feel the weight of the crowd, hear the sharp silence after his hand met my jaw, see the faces staring in shock. But over that memory rose something stronger, the sight of my unit standing as one, the sound of boots shifting in salute, the quiet power of respect earned not through revenge, but through resolve. The slap had once been a moment of humiliation meant to break me. Now it was a cautionary tale whispered in every corner of the command, a reminder that the weight of a uniform carries more than fabric and rank. It carries the truth that no one has the right to strike at your dignity. It had become a symbol not of pain, but of a line no one is allowed to cross. I lifted my chin as a group of recruits jogged past on the track. A few of them glanced my way. They didn't need to say anything. They knew. They all knew. It wasn't fear in their eyes. It was something quieter. Respect. Somewhere beyond this base, Douglas Maddox was living the small, quiet life that comes after a storm he built himself. I didn't think about him much anymore. He wasn't the center of the story. He never really had been. The story had always been about the moment someone decides they're done living in the shadow of another person's control. My voice, calm and steady, settled in the quiet of my mind like a promise. Sometimes family isn't a safe place. But honor is something no one gets to touch. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of waves crashing against the shore. I could have walked away from this base after everything, but I stayed. Not because I owed anyone anything, but because this ground had seen my worst moment and my strongest one. It was the place where I learned that silence can be as sharp as steel. As I reached the edge of the field, I looked back once. The sun was rising fully now, flooding everything with clean light. The shadow of that day was gone. All that remained was the story. And stories, when they belong to you, can't hurt you anymore. They can only live in the world as warnings or torches. This one had become both. I pulled in a breath and let it out slowly. Life isn't about erasing what happened. It's about owning it so completely that no one else can use it against you again. That's what I had done. If you've ever stood in silence, if you've ever chosen not to let someone define you with their violence, if you've ever turned pain into something unbreakable, then you already know what this story means. If you believe silence can be stronger than noise, leave a salute below.